Let's get some more on all of this. Senator Ed Markey is joining us. He's a Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, thanks for joining us.
No, you're welcome.
All right, we got a lot to discuss, but I want to begin with next week's scheduled testimony from the former FBI Director James Comey, scheduled to appear before the Senate Intelligence Committee Thursday morning for the first time since he was fired by President Trump. The White House now is considering invoking executive privilege to block his testimony. Are you worried that the president will prevent Comey from giving a full account of their exchanges?
Yeah, that would actually create a complete mess of this investigation of the potential Russian interference in the American elections. I think that the American people have a right to know whether or not in fact, President Trump asked Jim Comey to pledge his loyalty to Donald Trump, whether or not he asked Comey to let the Flynn investigation go, whether or not he told the president that on 3 separate occasions that the president was not under investigation, because we have to get the answers to those questions. And if the president attempts to invoke executive privilege, that would just continue to raise the question of obstruction of justice, which the very firing of Jim Comey has raised in the minds of the American people.
Senator, would the Senate respect the president's invocation of executive privilege, or will the Senate force the president to go to court, a federal court, and ask that court to block Director Comey from appearing?
Well, I would hope that Democrats and Republicans would put politics aside, put party aside, and put the best interest of our nation front and center, because ultimately the American people are entitled to these issues. And the Senate has prerogatives as well, which the president cannot truncate. So I would hope that Democrats and Republicans will stand strong and insist that Comey testify. And if the president attempts to invoke executive privilege, that the Senate use all of its prerogatives, including going to court, in order to ensure that Comey tells the Senate and through the Senate, the American people, what happened during that Russian investigation.
Well, Senator, I also want to get your thoughts on the White House punting all Russia-related questions to outside private legal counsel. Listen to Sean Spicer at the White House briefing today.
Can you clarify the nature of the conversations that Jared Kushner had with Russian officials and a banker in December, and what was the date of the meeting with the banker?
I cannot, and as I've mentioned the other day, that we're focused on the president's agenda, and going forward, all questions on these matters will be referred to outside counsel Markey.
But how can you not answer questions on it when the president himself tweets about it?
We're focused on his agenda, and going forward, all questions on this matter will be referred to outside counsel.
So what do you think of the White House strategy here, Senator Markey, especially in light of the fact that the president himself continues to frequently tweet, I should say, about the Russia probe, calling it a witch hunt?
Well, they want to go dark. They don't want to have to respond. They want private counsel to respond, and then private counsel to say we can't comment. And as a result, the American public won't be able to ask or get the answers to these questions. So again, it's just a further attempt to obfuscate, a further attempt to cover up the information which the American people have a right to know the answer to, including what was the subject material that Jared Kushner actually talked about with Russian banker. What was the subject material that Jared Kushner talked to Ambassador Kislyak about? The American people right now have a question about the compromise of their election last year, the presidential election, and during the transition period, what was the Trump administration doing? This is just another attempt to kind of sweep it under the rug, hope that time passes, hope that people lose their focus, that the press goes away, that other issues will arise. But it's not going to happen, Mr. President. The pressure is going to continue to mount until you give the American people the answers to these key questions, and every day that you delay is a step closer to a constitutional crisis.
As you know, there's a lot of speculation that the subject of those conversations may have been U.S. sanctions against Russia and lifting those sanctions. The former coordinator for sanctions policy at the State Department says it would be a free gift if the Trump administration were to relieve Russia of those sanctions without receiving anything in return. Do you worry that the Trump administration is going to take that step?
I do worry. I think that, unfortunately, Donald Trump has given signals that he believes that cozy cooperation with Putin is the pathway to a better world. But in Crimea, in the Ukraine, in Syria, in the compromise of the American presidential election in 2016, how many instances do we need to understand that Putin does not care about the values of human rights and of the values which are central to what America stands for? So I am very concerned that if the signal was ever sent from the Trump transition team that sanctions could be relieved without any actions by Russia to improve their own behavior, that would only further embolden Putin to continue to engage in these reckless activities, which in fact are undermining national security for the United States and for the rest of the world.
Very quickly, Senator, what about that report in the Washington Post that the Trump administration is actually moving toward the possibility of returning 2 diplomatic compounds to the Russians, one on the eastern shore of Maryland outside of Washington, one out on Long Island outside of New York? Those compounds, as you know, were confiscated in December in retaliation for Russian election meddling. What message would that send? Because you know the Russians, they really want those 2 compounds back.
Again, it's a signal to the Russian government that they're going to get what they want without, in fact, giving the United States what it needs. And that is just not acceptable. It is, again, almost like his decision to back out of the Paris Climate Accord, a presidential indifference to the role that the United States must play on these critical global issues to provide leadership for the entire planet. Giving back those diplomatic residences without a change in behavior by the Russians would be another historic mistake.
All right, Senator, stand by. There's more we need to discuss. There are other developments unfolding even as we speak. We'll take a